By dawn, the market stones had turned to a sheet of grey slush, and Christine Kelly crossed them with a wicker basket biting into her palm, one hand under the base to keep the mended linen from tipping into the meltwater, while the other clutched her shawl closed against the wind. Her left shoe had split at the seam 2 streets earlier. Each step took in cold water and kept it. Her toes had gone first from ache to numbness, then back to pain. The skin of her fingers was cracked from lye and frost, thin red lines opening each time the basket shifted and rubbed against her knuckles. Men unloading turnips glanced at her and then away. 2 women at the fish stall did not bother to lower their voices when they said Lady Voss had sent her stepdaughter out again, sent her to bargain for marrow bones and stale loaves, as though shame were one more errand to be entered on the household list. She heard plain girl, poor thing, and the harder word burden, spoken with the practical certainty reserved for weather and taxes. The verdict had followed her for years, plain, 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 until even servants repeated it because repetition felt like proof. Yet every face that looked too long betrayed the lie in spite of itself. Dark hair had escaped its pins and clung wetly to her neck. Her eyes looked larger in the winter pallor, grave and too watchful for her age. Hunger had sharpened her face into angles no painter would have called soft, but there was severity in her that made strangers stare and then pretend they had not. She set the basket down at a poulterer's block, read out Lady Voss's price in a voice made flat by practice, and endured the man's small smile when he named a higher one. Christine counted coins twice before yielding 1 more farthing than she could spare and moved on, because if she came home without the order fulfilled, Lady Voss would call it theft and ingratitude in the same breath. She had eaten a crust at midnight and nothing since. By the time the church bell struck 7, sour hunger had become a hollow, twisting thing under her ribs that made the smell of onions, yeast, and roasting chestnuts almost painful. She carried purchases no one in Voss House would acknowledge as labour. Bones wrapped in paper gone translucent with grease, carrots with blackened tops sold cheap because they were near spoil, half a loaf already hard at the edge, a twist of coarse salt measured to the ounce. She bargained not for herself but for the table where she sat last and rose first. Lady Voss's daughters would complain of thin broth and leave silver spoons sticky with jam on the cloth. Lady Voss would fold her napkin and pronounce the entire house badly managed, while Christine stood waiting to clear dishes that had never been offered to her. The rhythm was so settled that even mercy had to hide itself. Mrs. Finch in the kitchens would sometimes slide a peeled potato into Christine's apron pocket and look away as if she had done nothing. Old Thomas, once her father's coachman, would mutter about the weather and leave the scullery door unlatched so she could warm her hands for 1 minute at the stove. Those tiny kindnesses had the stealth of crimes. Christine knew exactly how the day would proceed once she re-entered the iron gate. She would run the account slips to the draper and the coal merchant because Lady Voss no longer trusted boys with messages that involved money. She would stitch torn cuffs in the afternoon light until her eyes blurred and the needle doubled itself. She would carry laundry up narrow stairs to an attic room where the roof leaked near the chimney and a basin sat permanently under the drip. She would not be thanked. If she moved slowly, she would be corrected. If she moved quickly, she would be told she was clumsy. The body learned what the tongue could not answer. Keep still, keep quiet, keep going. At the baker's cart, the boy in flower-streaked sleeves held up yesterday's loaves and named a price meant for cottagers, then lowered it when he saw the Voss crest branded onto her basket lid and understood she had been sent to wrestle pennies in public. Christine paid and asked for bones from the back barrel where dogs usually fed, because stock stretched farther than pride. While he wrapped them, she watched her breath cloud and disappear and felt the old anger rise with no place to go. Voss House had once belonged to her father-in-law and Labour both. He had kept neat ledgers in a locked oak desk and taught her figures before he taught her dancing. Columns first, he had said, because numbers did not flatter and did not forget. He had signed a debt paper for a man who swore it was routine shipping credit, then another, then a third, each one folded into language so clever it obscured the trap until interest swallowed the estate's income whole. He had died with apology on his tongue and shame in his lungs, never understanding how thoroughly he had been hunted by men who called themselves respectable. Her mother, soft-hearted and frightened, had remarried inside a year to avoid creditors, and winter both. Lady Voss arrived in silk and lavender, brought 2 daughters with matching smiles, and took inventory of every room as if measuring cloth. By the time Christine turned 20, family portraits had been moved to lesser halls, silver had been sold, and the story of ruin had been rewritten so often it stood in place of truth. "Female incompetence," Lady Voss said to callers, glancing at Christine as though she were discussing weather damage to a roof. Her husband left matters in disorder. The child has no head for management. We do what we can. Then she would send Christine through sleet to settle the very accounts Christine alone could still read without error. Near the fountain, a butcher's wife caught Christine's sleeve and asked, almost kindly, whether the rumours were true, whether Lady Voss meant to marry her to Mr. Pell, the widowed moneylender with the yellow cravat and careful hands. Christine did not answer at once. Words sat in her throat like iron filings. The match had been discussed in rooms where she poured tea and pretended deafness. Mr. Pell was near 60, prosperous, exact, and eager for a wife with no dowry who could not refuse him without seeming ungrateful to those funding her bread. Lady Voss called it prudent. "A woman in your position cannot be fanciful," she had said last evening. "Rustle of silk first, lavender second, command third. You will secure our obligations. You owe this household your obedience." Christine had stood with a tray balanced on blistered fingers and understood that debt had become argument, then sentence. She gave the butcher's wife a brief nod that was not consent, not confession, only acknowledgement of facts too public to deny. The woman released her sleeve and crossed herself without thinking. Christine moved on. Snowmelt seeped deeper through her shoe. Her hem grew heavier with every step and slapped cold against her shins. Children ran past chasing a hoop, clean-faced and shrill with health, and she turned away before wanting could show. She did not cry in the square. She had taught herself that economy too. Tears wasted salt and invited questions. By the time she reached the far arcade where solicitors kept offices above apothecaries and saddlers, her hands trembled from cold and from the effort of holding the basket steady. She shifted its weight to her other hip and felt the bruise there flare sharp, yellowed at the edge where an earlier collision with a pantry door had left its mark. Lady Voss had called the bruise carelessness. Christine had called it Tuesday and kept walking. When she finally returned through the side gate of Voss House, the courtyard pump was already crowded with maids beating sheets against boards, steam rising from wash-tubs into the bitter air. No one looked up long. Labour recognised Labour and had no leisure for pity. She set the market basket on the scullery table, counted each item aloud for Mrs. Finch, and watched the cook make quick marks in chalk on a slate, because paper had become too dear for kitchen tallies. "You are soaked through," Mrs. Finch said under her breath, eyes on the pot, not on Christine. "Change if you can." If you can meant if Lady Voss does not call first. Christine nodded and lifted the heavier basket of wet linen that waited by the stairs. The house smelled of coal smoke, polish, and the faint floral sharpness that always announced her stepmother's movements before the woman appeared. On the first landing, a footman passed, carrying a tray of chocolate to the blue drawing-room. On the second, she paused to shift the basket and flex her fingers, feeling each split in the skin sting where soap had found it. At the attic door, the latch stuck, as it always did in damp weather, then gave way with a soft crack. Her room held one narrow bed, one chair with a loose rung, and a washstand angled under the roof leak. A tin bowl sat beneath the drip. Plink, plink, plink. She set down the linen and stripped off her wet stockings, rubbing her feet hard until sensation returned in hot pins. Through the thin wall she could hear laughter from a lower floor, bright and careless, followed by the smooth rise of Lady Voss's voice carrying instructions she never delivered twice, because she expected perfect memory from those she considered lesser. Christine wrapped her hands in a scrap of clean cloth to keep the cracks from reopening, then went down again before she was summoned, because the day had only begun, and hunger, cold, and shame were duties in this house, kept as regular as prayers. She had reached the back stairs when the breakfast gong sounded below, a hard brass note that travelled up stone and wood, and meant the household would begin demanding what she had not yet done. Christine adjusted the wrapped cloth around her hands and carried the wet linen down one flight, then another, each step damp from boots and kitchen traffic. On the turn of the second landing she passed the portrait that had once hung in her father's study. It showed him younger, shoulders square, one hand resting on the oak desk where he had taught her columns and balance sheets by candlelight. Lady Voss had moved it to the servants' stair 2 years earlier because, she said, the frame was too dark for formal rooms. The paint had cracked near his mouth. Someone had knocked the corner and never repaired it. She paused only long enough to set the basket against her hip and keep walking. In the blue drawing-room, silk rustled before words came. Lady Voss stood near the fire in plum velvet trimmed with jet beads, lavender trailing her like a warning. Her daughters sat with chocolate cups and sugared toast, both in pale morning gowns that had been altered from fabric once ordered for Christine's first season. "You are late," Lady Voss said, though Christine had arrived before the first cup was poured. "The coals in the east chamber have not been laid. Miss Alice cannot dress in cold air." Alice did not look up from her plate. Marianne did, eyes bright with that shallow interest cruelty often wore. "Her hem is wet to the knee," Marianne said. "It leaves marks on the carpet." Lady Voss turned her head, not quite toward Christine, as if speaking to a maid she had not bothered to identify. "That is what comes of poor management. Her mother never understood a household. Sentiment in place of figures, indulgence in place of order. We still pay for it." The words landed with old precision, each one selected to erase what had been true. Her mother had understood order well enough until grief hollowed her judgment. Her father had understood figures better than most men in the county. He had simply believed the wrong gentleman at the wrong table. Christine kept her gaze lowered to the tray stand and said, "What else is required, Lady Voss?" "Everything," Lady Voss replied. "As usual." She moved through the room on sore feet and gathered plates while they ate. Butter streaked the silver knife she lifted. Jam clung to the rim of Marianne's cup like bloodless paint. The fire threw warmth towards silk and jewels, never far enough to reach where she stood. Lady Voss drank slowly, then held out a folded paper without offering it to Christine directly. "Mr. Pell calls at noon tomorrow. You will receive him with gratitude." Christine did not extend her hand until the older woman lowered the page onto the side table, making the transfer look accidental and therefore deniable. The paper was heavy rag stock, the kind used for contracts. She did not open it. "I understand your instruction," she said. "No, you will state your duty." Lady Voss's smile remained fixed. "There is a difference." Alice laughed softly into her cup. Marianne set down her toast and studied Christine's face as though searching for cracks. "State it," Marianne echoed, pleased to borrow authority. Christine felt the old heat rise in her throat, the one she had trained herself to swallow. She could not afford spectacle. Not here, not now. "My duty," she said, the words dry as ash, "is to obey the head of this house." Lady Voss inclined her head as if receiving tribute. "At last, accuracy," she turned to her daughters. "You see how necessity educates where affection failed." Christine lifted the breakfast tray and crossed toward the door. On the escritoire by the window sat her mother's pearl comb, now missing 2 teeth, laid carelessly beside Marianne's gloves. The comb had been taken from Christine's trunk after the funeral and called a household item. In this house, anything she had once touched became common property the moment someone richer wanted it. Her room had been surrendered first, then her bookshelves, then the pianoforte her father bought when she was 14 and serious about scales. The music room became Alice's sitting parlour. Her gowns were cut down, re-sewn, and worn by both sisters with laughter over how poorly the original owner had filled them. Even the little walnut desk from her childhood schoolroom had gone to Marianne's bedchamber because it matched the wallpaper. Lady Voss named each taking practical. She called it redistribution. She called it female prudence. She called Christine lucky not to be turned out entirely. By the winter of 1826, the language had hardened into household law. In the passage outside, old Thomas waited with a coal scuttle and eyes that had watched 3 generations enter and fail the same door. He shifted the weight to spare her the carry and spoke without moving his lips. "She has had letters from Pell this morning." Christine kept her face still. "I expected as much." Thomas glanced toward the drawing-room and lowered his voice further. "Your father would not—" He stopped himself, jaw working once, and tried again. "Your father trusted paper. That was his sorrow." The line struck so cleanly she almost lost hold of the tray. She saw again the last autumn before his death. His cuffs ink-stained, his breathing short, still bent over contracts that multiplied each time he believed one had been settled. He had never hidden figures from her. Even when fever had taken his steadiness, he had asked her to read entries aloud, to test them against receipts, to mark margins in a neat legal hand he praised with weary pride. Then the winter cough deepened, and the doctor came too late. After his death, hurried remarriage papers and creditor agreements brought Lady Voss into the household as Christine's stepmother because creditors pressed at the gate, and there was no son to shield them. Within 18 months, an apoplexy in that new branch of the family left title and practical control consolidated under Lady Voss, exactly as the terms she had insisted upon before signing aloud. Christine remembered the day her mother's black dresses were packed away and lavender sachets replaced rosewater in the linen presses. She remembered more sharply still the day her mother followed her father to the churchyard, worn thin by grief and a lung fever that would not break, leaving Christine to women who measured kindness in profit. "The east chamber first," Thomas murmured, passing back into servant silence as footsteps approached. Mrs. Finch appeared with flour on her sleeve and a folded list pinned to her apron. "Lady Voss says you are to check the pantry tallies," she said in a voice pitched for walls. "She says there was a discrepancy in coffee and lamp oil." There had been no discrepancy. There never was when Christine kept the books. Lady Voss announced shortages in public and corrections in private, always where witnesses would hear blame and never hear retraction. Christine nodded and took the list. "I will reconcile it." Mrs. Finch's eyes met hers for one brief second. They held apology and warning both. The pantry lay off the old morning room that had once been her father's office. The lock had been changed. The desk had been removed. In its place stood narrow shelves of preserves and tea canisters, each labelled in Lady Voss's elaborate hand. Christine set down the tray, unpinned the tally list and began counting by touch as much as sight. 2 tins of coffee, 1 opened, 4 bottles of lamp oil, 1 low, sugar in the blue crock, short by ½ a pound because Alice sweetened chocolate twice each morning and blamed kitchen boys for theft. She wrote the true numbers on scrap and folded it into her apron. On the second shelf, behind spice jars, she found the account book for household purchases. Lady Voss had entered last week's figures herself in thick ink that blotted at every curve. Charges appeared twice under different dates. 1 coal invoice had been copied with a changed total. A ribbon of unease moved under Christine's ribs, not surprise, not yet fear, something colder and more exact. Lady Voss had always managed humiliation as sport. This was management as strategy. Debts had been her instrument for years. Now they were becoming a weapon with a timetable. Christine turned pages, measured handwriting, and felt her father's lessons return with painful clarity. When numbers repeat, ask who profits. When signatures vary, ask who stands to gain by speed. She heard Silk in the doorway and closed the book at once. Lady Voss stood framed by dim light, one gloved hand on the jamb. "You have been long over simple counting," she said, "or are figures too complex this morning?" Christine held the folded tally slip in her palm, hidden against her skirt. "The entries required correction. From you." Lady Voss stepped into the pantry, lavender sharpening the close air. "Take care, Christine. Incompetence is forgivable. Insolence is not." She reached past Christine, lifted a sealed packet from the upper shelf, and pressed it into her hands, with enough force to sting the cracked skin through cloth. Red wax bore Lady Voss's crest. "You will go to Branton and Hale in town. You will place this in Mr. Hale's hand and wait for his receipt. You will not speak to anyone. You will not delay." Christine looked at the seal, then at the woman who had turned her mother's morning house into a ledger of punishments. "Yes, Lady Voss." Lady Voss's gaze dropped briefly to Christine's wrapped fingers, then to the wet edge of her hem, and returned to her face without change. "Do try not to disgrace us in public more than usual." She turned and left, Silk whispering over Stone. Christine stood one moment longer in the pantry's narrow cold, packet in one hand, corrected tally in the other, and felt the weight of years settle into a single errand. Then she tucked the tally slip into her cuff, drew her shawl tighter, and went out through the side passage toward the yard. Christine stepped into the yard wind and felt it cut through wool and bone in one pass. The cobbles between the scullery arch and the side gate were glazed with old ice where carriage wheels had scored dark tracks through white. She kept one hand over the sealed packet inside her shawl and the other tight around the knot at her throat. Behind her, Voss House rose in soot-dark stone with shuttered windows and no light in the upper panes where servants slept. Ahead, the lane dropped toward the market road, then bent east to the coaching yard where town traffic thickened by mid-morning. She chose speed over warmth and walked with her head down, skirts lifted clear of the slush where she could, boots soaking where she could not. At the corner by the chandler she paused to let a brewer's dray pass, breath smoking in front of her face. Men perched atop barrels turned to look as she waited, then looked again when they recognised the Voss crest stamped into the leather strap at her wrist. Recognition had become another form of exposure. She was the stepdaughter sent out in weather fit for dogs. She was the one made to carry contracts while Silk sat by the fire. She crossed when the lane cleared and kept moving. By the time she reached the long wall of Branton's coaching yard, her fingers had gone stiff around the packet and the cloth wrappings under them had dampened through. The yard gates stood open. Inside, a mail coach was being loaded, trunks heaved to the roof by men shouting rates and destinations over the grind of wheels. A boy with a bell called "Departures" in a voice already hoarse. Steam rose from horse flanks and vanished in the cold. Christine threaded between stacked hampers and a woman arguing over a lost valise, aiming for the side passage that led to Branton and Hale's offices above the ticket room. Safe noise, ordinary noise, the kind that held no room for private catastrophe. Then a scream tore across the yard from the west gate. Heads turned. A chestnut horse burst through at full gallop, reins trailing, eyes white, iron shoes striking sparks off stone. It slammed one shoulder against a post, skidded, recovered, and drove forward again through men and baggage. Someone shouted for rope. Someone else jumped clear and fell. A slight young courier in the livery of Ashford House was spun aside by the horse's flank and thrown hard against the mounting block. He slid to the ground and did not rise. Christine had already dropped her basket and run. Her knees hit slush beside him. The cold went through her stockings like needles. The courier's hat had flown off. Dark hair clung to his brow where skin had split at the edge. Blood threaded down toward his temple in a thin, bright line and mixed with meltwater. He was breathing too fast, shallow and sharp. One arm was trapped under him at an awkward angle. She spoke before she thought, low and firm, the way Mrs. Finch spoke to scalded maids and panicked scullions. "Look at me! Keep your eyes open. Do not move." He made a small sound and tried to roll. She slid one hand under his shoulder to steady him and felt the wrapped skin at her knuckles split again. Warm wetness spread under the cloth. Around them boots stopped and shuffled and stopped again. Men stared with the helplessness of those who feared doing the wrong thing more than they feared doing nothing. A rider came through the same west gate on a black gelding lathered at the neck, pulled it up so sharply the animal reared, then dropped back with a metallic strike of shoe on stone. The rider dismounted before the groom who ran toward him, reached his stirrup, tall, broad through the shoulders beneath a dark military greatcoat, hair black with sleet, face cut hard as quarried rock. He crossed the yard in 4 long steps, and his voice reached her before his shadow did. "Stand back." She did not move. She had pressed her palm to the courier's side to keep him still, and she held there, counting his breath by instinct. The stranger stopped over them, Winter in human form, gaze flicking once over the fallen courier, once over her hands, once over the line of blood at the young man's brow. "You will keep pressure there," he said, already dropping to one knee opposite her, one gloved hand bracing the courier's shoulder with controlled force. "Hale, send for the infirmary cart, now." It was only when the yardmaster answered, "At once, Your Grace," that the title struck through the noise and landed. Duke Holden Ashford. Everyone in 3 counties knew the name even if they had never seen his face. Widower, soldier, master of half the valley and the men in it. A man who gave orders and heard them obeyed before the echo died. Christine felt the social distance between them like a physical drop under her feet, a cliff edge disguised as cobbles, and kept her hand exactly where it was because the courier was still breathing too quickly, and fear would not be allowed to make her foolish. "His arm," she said, not looking up. "Do not let anyone pull him by it." "I had no intention of permitting fools to do so." The words were clipped, but he shifted his weight at once to shield the courier from the crowding boots. She tugged at the hem of her petticoat, found the inner seam with numb fingers, and tore a long strip free with one sharp pull that sounded louder than it should in the winter yard. Men stared. A woman near the coach made the sign of the cross. Christine folded the linen and pressed it gently against the cut at the courier's brow. The Duke's eyes snapped to her hands. "That cloth is clean. As clean as this yard allows." "Good." He said it like a command that happened to agree with her. She slid the bandage into place and tied it behind the courier's head, then steadied his chin when his teeth began to chatter. The Duke removed one glove with his teeth, touched 2 fingers to the young man's throat, and counted under his breath. His voice, when he spoke again, was lower. "Daniel, hear me!" The courier's eyes fluttered. "My lord." "You are alive. Breathe slowly." Daniel tried and failed, panic rising again. Christine leaned closer until he could see only her face, not the ring of strangers, not the horse stamping nearby, not the Duke's hard profile bent over him. "Match me," she said. "In, out, in, out." He followed on the 3rd attempt. His breaths lengthened by degrees. The Duke watched her, and she felt the weight of that observation as distinctly as she felt the slush soaking into her knees. By the 2nd minute, the infirmary cart rattled through the side gate. 2 attendants jumped down with a stretcher. The Duke gave concise instructions. Head supported, arm untouched, move on my count. They obeyed as if bound by wire. Christine kept pressure on the bandage until the last possible instant, then eased back as Daniel was lifted and laid in the cart bed, jaw clenched against pain but conscious. She rose too quickly. The yard tilted once and righted. Blood and meltwater had darkened the front of her skirt to the knee. Her hands shook from cold and effort both. She wiped them on the ruined strip left from her hem and reached for the packet inside her shawl by reflex, needing to know it had not fallen in the rush. It was still there, wax seal intact. The Duke stood when she did. Up close he was taller than rumour had prepared her for, coat open at the throat where a dark cravat sat perfectly despite the chase. Rain caught on his lashes and not yet melted. His jaw tightened once as his gaze dropped to her wrist. The sleeve had ridden back when she reached for the packet. Faded yellow and purple bruises showed clear against winter-pale skin, finger marks old enough to be turning green at the edge. "Those are not kitchen marks." There was no softness in the statement, no pretence of not seeing. It struck cleaner than pity would have. Christine pulled her sleeve down with measured care. "No one asked for an inventory, Your Grace?" His eyes lifted to her face. Grey, almost colourless in the weak light, and unwavering. For one suspended beat the yard noise thinned to hoof, stamps, and distant wheels. Then he turned to the attendants. "She comes in the cart." One of the men looked uncertainly between title and mud-stained woman. "My lord, there is scarcely room." "There is room." Christine found her voice before the attendants could move to usher her. "I have business at Branton and Hale." The Duke's gaze returned, sharper now. "Your business can wait." "It cannot." He looked as if no one had said that word to him in months, perhaps years. Wind tugged loose strands of her hair across her cheek. She did not brush them aside. She held the packet under her shawl where he could not see it, and knew that refusal in public could cost a servant a post, could cost a tenant a lease, could cost a woman like her far more than either. But Daniel was conscious. The cart was staffed, and the paper she carried might already be part of a trap tightening around her throat. Delay was a luxury she no longer owned. "I am charged to deliver documents by hand," she said. "I will come once they are receipted." His expression did not change, yet something in it shifted from command to assessment. He nodded once to the yardmaster. "Take Daniel to Dr. Fenwick. Tell him I will follow." Then to her, quieter but no less absolute. "You will be at the infirmary within 20 minutes." She should have agreed and ended it. Instead, she answered the truth as she had lived it, pared to bone. "I will be there if they permit me to leave." His brow drew a fraction, as if the line had struck a place not yet scarred over. He stepped aside, giving her the narrow lane between cartwheel and hitching post, but did not take his eyes off her. "Name, Christine Kelly." Recognition did not show, only attention settling harder. "Go, Miss Kelly." She turned and crossed the yard on legs that had not fully steadied. At the door, beneath Branton and Hale's painted sign, she glanced back once, despite herself. The Duke had not mounted. He stood beside the cart with one bare hand on the rail, still as a sentry in winter, watching until she disappeared inside. The stair to Branton and Hale was narrow and poorly lit, and Christine climbed it with wet skirts clinging to her calves, and the sealed packet pressed flat beneath her palm, as though body heat could guard wax from treachery. Voices murmured beyond the frosted glass at the landing. A clerk in ink-stained cuffs looked up when she entered the outer office, took in her hem dark with slush, the blood on the torn edge of her petticoat, and the crest worked into the packet seal, then stood too quickly and upset a stack of folded briefs. "I require Mr. Hale," she said. "Lady Voss sent papers for his hand only." The clerk gathered his composure by force. "Mr. Hale is with a client." "I was instructed to wait for receipt." He hesitated. Her appearance argued servant. Her tone argued otherwise. At last he opened the inner door and disappeared. Christine stood by the coal grate without extending her hands toward heat, because she had learned that comfort offered in one room could be billed as insolence in another. The smell of parchment and sealing wax filled the space. On the wall hung framed notices of legal reforms written in dense script, meant for men with money and time. Beneath them 2 chairs waited for petitioners. Neither was offered to her. When the clerk returned, he held the door wider. "Mr. Hale will see you now." The solicitor's room was warmer, smaller, and lined floor to ceiling with deed boxes, labelled by estate. Branton, Hale, Fenwick, Ashford, Voss. The last sat on the corner of his desk, under his hand, as though he had been reading from it when she was announced. Mr. Hale was narrow-faced, 50 perhaps, with a wig gone thin at the temples, and spectacles low on his nose. He did not rise. "You are Lady Voss's stepdaughter." "I am Christine Kelly." "Quite." He extended 2 fingers. "The packet." She placed it in his hand and watched him break the red wax. His eyes moved quickly over the first page, slowed on the second, then sharpened with professional alertness that did not conceal unease. "You will wait while my clerk prepares your acknowledgement." "I will wait." He reached for a fresh sheet, dipped his pen, and began writing in a legal hand that favoured loops where finality would have been kinder. As he wrote, she let her gaze move once across the desk and saw, under his elbow, a parchment headed "Petition for Emergency Guardianship and Immediate Matrimonial Settlement." Her own name sat 3 lines down. So did Mr. Pell's. The date below was tomorrow's. Her stomach tightened hard enough to steal breath. She felt, absurdly, the old attic drip in her bones. Plink, 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 not fear alone. Calculation, Mr. Hale sanded the page and pushed it toward her. Sign there, Miss Kelly, to confirm delivery and notice. Notice of what? His mouth compressed. Of proceedings already filed by your legal guardian. On what grounds? On grounds of insolvency risk and your presumed incapacity to manage inherited obligations. The phrase was one she had heard in Lady Voss's voice for years, now translated into law and sharpened to a point. Christine did not touch the pen. I have made no such admission. The filing does not require your admission. Then it requires false witness. His gaze lifted fully to her for the first time. Take care. With what, sir? Accuracy. Colour touched his cheekbones. Irritation, then caution. Lady Voss has supplied account statements. Duplicated charges and altered dates. You have examined them. I keep those accounts when I am permitted. Mr. Hale tapped the petition with one finger. That is not the issue before this office. It is the only issue if those figures are untrue. Silence held between them, thin and dangerous. In the corridor outside, Boots crossed the boards and moved on. Hale removed his spectacles, cleaned them slowly, and replaced them, as if the motion might change the words already written. You are not represented, he said. You cannot contest this here. I can refuse to sign a lie. You can refuse. The filing proceeds regardless. She looked down at the acknowledgement. Receipt and notice accepted. No mention of understanding, no mention of consent. Yet signature would be displayed later as obedience. She had spent too many years watching language do violence without raising a hand. I will sign delivery only. He frowned. There is no space for annotation. She took the pen from his fingers, dipped it once, and wrote in the margin with the steady, legal hand her father had taught her at 12. Received under protest. Contents disputed as to fact and capacity. No consent to matrimonial disposition. Mr. Hale stared at the line as if it had spoken aloud in church. You have no standing to alter. I have standing to describe what I do. For a moment he looked almost weary. You make this harder than it need be. It was not made hard by me. He sanded the margin note with visible reluctance and handed the page to the clerk at the door. Copy and file. The clerk vanished. Hale gathered the remaining documents into a neat stack and tied them with green tape. There is one further matter. A codicil to your father's will was mentioned in earlier correspondence, but no original has been produced. Without original instrument, succession claims are narrow. Christine held herself still. Who mentioned it? A former copying clerk, dead now. No affidavit survived. Her pulse gave one hard beat. Codicil. She had seen the word once in her father's hand in an old index and never found the paper itself. Lady Voss had called it childish fantasy and burned 3 trunks of obsolete rubbish the same week. Mr. Hale's voice turned brisk again. You may go. Bring no further annotations into my office without counsel. He slid a folded receipt across the desk. She took it and tucked it into her cuff beside the pantry tally. 2 scraps. 2 forms of truth no one had asked for. When she reached the outer door, he spoke once more, not looking up. Miss Kelly, if you wish to avoid public unpleasantness, persuade Lady Voss privately. Courts are blunt instruments. She paused with her hand on the latch. Blunt instruments are still instruments. Outside, the cold struck her face like a rebuke. The yard had settled into strained order. Men righted trunks. Grooms muttered over the chestnut now tied and quivering. A smear of blood remained near the mounting block where slush had not yet washed it away. Christine crossed to the lane at once, counting her steps against the Duke's order and her own vow. 20 minutes, he had said. She had used 14. By the time the church clock struck the quarter, she was at Dr. Fenwick's infirmary door with her breath burning and her shawl damp through at the shoulders. The waiting room was narrow, packed, and over-bright from too many lamps. A farm wife held a boy with a croupy cough. A carter cradled 2 wrapped fingers and stared at the floor. In the corner Daniel sat propped on a bench, arms splintered and bound, face pale beneath freckles, lower lip caught between his teeth to keep it steady. His livery coat had been cut at the sleeve. He looked very young. He saw her and tried to rise. "Oh, do not," she said, moving to him at once. "You are to keep still." "His Grace said you would come," he whispered. The words should not have mattered. They did. She put that aside and touched the edge of his bandage, checking for seepage. Dry. Good. Dr. Fenwick emerged from the treatment room, wiping his hands. "You were with him in the yard?" "Yes." "You did correctly. The pressure likely spared him worse trouble." He glanced at Daniel's shaking shoulders. "He needs warmth and broth. There are blankets in short supply today." Christine looked down at her own shawl, the only dry layer she had left. Wind had already stolen what heat her dress held. She untied the knot at her throat without hesitation and settled the wool around Daniel's shoulders, tucking it under his good arm. "You will return this to Ashford House," she told him. "Not before." His eyes widened. "Miss, I cannot—" "You can!" At the reception desk, the assistant coughed politely. "Fee for setting and dressing has not yet been entered." A shadow moved across the frosted glass of the inner door. The Duke stepped into the room, greatcoat unbuttoned, rein dark at the hem, expression unreadable. He placed a coin purse on the desk with controlled finality. "Enter it to my account." Christine turned before the assistant could reach for the purse. "No!" The single word rang too sharply for the room. Several heads lifted. Daniel froze under the shawl. The Duke's gaze settled on her with glacial steadiness. "Explain." "Use your account for his medicines and food, not for me." "I did not say it was for you, no, but they will infer it. They always do." A muscle shifted in his jaw. "You are concerned with inference in a sick room." "I am concerned with debt in any room." They stood 2 paces apart, the infirmary noise reduced to breathing, and the soft clink of glass behind the treatment door. He looked at the shawl on Daniel, then at the sleeves of her dress where damp had climbed nearly to the elbow. "Take the purse anyway," he said. "Call it wages for work performed." Christine held his gaze, though her skin had begun to tremble from cold. "I did not tend him for wages." He did not speak at once. Then, quieter, "No, you did not." He turned to the desk assistant. "My account covers the boy only. Record it clearly." "It will be done, Your Grace." Christine drew one careful breath. "Thank you." His eyes moved to her cuff, where the corner of Mr. Hale's receipt showed. "You delivered your papers." "Yes. And?" She should have said nothing. He had rank, not right. Yet the petition's words pressed at her throat like thorns. "And I was instructed to sign notice of my own incapacity." His expression didn't shift, but stillness gathered in him, dangerous in a different way than anger. "Did you sign?" "I signed receipt. I did not sign submission." A pause. Then the smallest movement at the edge of his mouth. Not a smile, not quite. "Good." Daniel stirred beneath the shawl and looked between them with drowsy confusion. Christine crouched to settle the wool higher at his neck, and found her fingers clumsy now that urgency had ebbed. The Duke stepped closer, not touching either of them, and held the shawl edge while she tucked it. His hand was bare again. Scar crossed his knuckles, pale against weathered skin. She noticed because she should not have. When Daniel's breathing steadied, she rose too quickly and swayed once. The room narrowed at the edges. She caught the bench back and straightened. The Duke's voice dropped to command. "Sit! I cannot remain! Sit for 1 minute." It was absurd that the order carried warmth. It was more absurd that she obeyed. She sat on the end of the bench, wet skirt dripping onto worn boards, and stared at her hands until the shaking lessened. He remained standing, a dark line between her and the door, fielding the room's curiosity by sheer indifference. No one approached. After a minute she stood again. "I must return before dusk." "No," he said, "you will not run through sleet without a cloak." "I have no other." He removed his greatcoat in one deliberate motion and held it out. "I cannot take your Grace's coat." "You can!" The answer mirrored her own to Daniel so precisely it would have been almost dry amusement in another life. She felt heat rise to her face despite the cold. "It will be remarked upon," she said. "Let it be remarked that you did not freeze on my watch." Words failed her for a heartbeat. She accepted the coat because refusal had become theatre, and she had no strength left for performance. It settled over her shoulders heavy and warm, lined with wool that still held the outside rain, and his body heat beneath it. At the door she turned back to Daniel. "Sleep if you can, no heroics." He managed a weak nod. The Duke moved aside to give her passage, then spoke just low enough that only she heard. "You wrote in the margin, did you not?" She looked up sharply. "How would you know that?" "Mr. Hale sends copies of unusual filings to those affected by them." "Why would he send one to you?" "Because the petition touches Ashford Trust instruments through Pell's lending network?" The answer widened the map beneath her feet. Mr. Pell, Lady Voss, Ashford accounts. Threads she had suspected, tied now in one hard knot. She tightened her hands inside the sleeves of his coat. "Then you know she filed for 3 days." "I know. And you came here for your ward's glove." A long pause. "I came because Daniel dropped his glove," he said evenly, "and because I do not ignore forged paper when it crosses my road." It was not tenderness. It was not confession. It was something colder and perhaps more reliable. Alignment. A nurse opened the treatment door and called for bandages, breaking the moment cleanly. Christine inclined her head. "Your Grace?" "Miss Kelly!" She stepped into the lane. Rain had replaced sleet, thin and relentless, turning the cobbles black. Across from the infirmary stood the small chapel used by travellers too poor for private pews. Its rail ran along the pavement, iron cold enough to burn skin. Christine crossed to it and set both hands on the metal, head bowed, Duke's coat heavy around her like borrowed authority. Her shoulders began to shake. Inside the infirmary doorway, Halden Ashford came to a stop and watched through rain-streaked glass, his face unreadable as he mistook the motion for grief. He did not see, not yet, that when she lifted her head, water on her lashes and breath ragged with strain, her mouth had curved into a sharp, astonished laugh meant for neither him nor victory, but for the first crack in a wall that had stood for years. The laugh left her as quickly as it came, cut off by cold and exhaustion, and she pressed her mouth closed against the raw sound of it, one hand still gripping the chapel rail until iron bit into her palm. Rain slid from the brim of the borrowed coat and struck the black stone below in thin, relentless taps. Her breath came unevenly. Her shoulders trembled again, though now from spent strength rather than grief. Behind her, the infirmary door opened. She heard the hinge, then the measured tread of boots on wet pavement. "Miss Kelly!" She did not turn at once. She had no shape for this moment. She had expected accusation, perhaps contempt, perhaps the dry correction reserved for women who displayed strange feeling in public. When she faced him, Duke Haldon Ashford stood a few feet away in shirt-sleeves, rain darkening linen at his forearms, his greatcoat still on her shoulders. He had come into the weather without hesitation and without complaint, as if cold had no jurisdiction over him. His expression remained carved and controlled, but he had not kept to the doorway. He had crossed to her. "Why are you laughing?" he asked. The question was quiet. It landed harder than command. Christine looked at him and felt another startled edge of laughter rise, then break against something close to tears. She hated both. She gave him the truth, stripped of ornament. "Because she filed papers to declare me unfit to count my own father's debts, and in the same hour I learned he left a codicil she could not find." Rain tracked down his temple and along the line of his jaw. He did not wipe it away. "You are certain?" "I am certain only that a clerk once copied mention of it. Mr. Hale believes the original is missing." Her fingers tightened on the rail. "Lady Voss burned trunks after my mother died. I thought it gone. I thought all of it gone." Her breath hitched once. "And now there is a chance it is not." His gaze held hers with unsettling steadiness. "That is why you laughed?" "Yes. Not because of me." The bluntness would have stung from any other mouth. From his it sounded like a man checking the position of a wound before he set bone. "No, Your Grace," she said, "not because of you." A pause stretched between them, filled with rain and chapel silence. His mouth shifted a fraction. Not softness. Recognition. "Good," he said. The single word should have felt absurd in that weather, in those clothes, with her hands split and her future narrowing to 3 legal days. Instead, it steadied her. She released the iron rail and instantly swayed. He moved 1 step forward. "Stop!" The command was sharp enough to freeze her. "You are about to fall." "I am not. You are shaking from head to heel." She hated that he was right. She hated more that he had noticed before she admitted it to herself. Christine drew her spine straighter under the heavy coat and set both feet apart on the slick stone. "I can stand." "You can," he said. "You should not be standing in rain." He glanced toward the infirmary door, then back to her face, as if measuring which refusal would cost less. She expected him to issue another order. Instead, he waited. The waiting unsettled her more than force. By the time the chapel bell marked the half-hour, the street had thinned. A grocer's cart rattled past toward the square. 2 women under 1 umbrella looked at them, recognized him, and looked away with practiced speed. Haldon spoke again, lower. "You wrote in the margin because you understood what that signature would become in court." "Yes." "You did not do it for defiance." "No." "You did it to preserve standing." "Yes." Rain gathered on his lashes. He did not blink it away. "Who taught you legal notation?" "My father, when I was 12. "Who knows this?" "No one who would admit it in Lady Voss's drawing-room." He gave 1 short nod. "I know it now." The words settled in her like unexpected heat. For years every skill had been named inconvenient, unladylike, dangerous, wasted. She had hidden competency like contraband. To hear it stated as fact, without mockery, left her strangely unguarded. She turned her face from him, toward the chapel windows clouded by damp. "Knowledge has not been useful to me. It has kept you alive. It has kept me busy." It has kept you exact when others required you to be helpless. She looked back sharply. You speak as if you have watched this for years. His expression did not alter. I have watched since this morning. Since the yard. Before the yard. His eyes dropped briefly to her wrapped hands, then rose again. You counted coins at Branton's gate while your fingers were bleeding through cloth. You checked a wax seal in a crowd while a horse was still loose. You surrendered your only dry shawl and argued against debt while half frozen. Helpless is not the word. Her throat tightened with a feeling she did not trust. She tried to answer with formality and missed by an inch. You keep account of strangers quickly, Your Grace. I do not keep account of everyone. No warmth coloured the line, no flirtation, no performance for the street. It was simply spoken, and therefore far more dangerous. Christine felt her pulse jump against bruised skin. She reached for distance. You owe me nothing. I owe Daniel his safety, he said. I owe the court accuracy when fraud touches my trust instruments. He held her gaze. And I owe myself the honesty not to walk away while you are being cornered. The last words struck with quiet force because they were not dressed as gallantry. Cornered was the correct word. She had lived inside it so long she had stopped naming it. She looked down at the sleeves of his coat, swallowing her wrists. If you remain here much longer, you will be the one sent to Dr. Fenwick. I will survive rain. You are already wet through. So are you. Silence again. She could not remember a man of rank ever standing in weather for her, let alone one who spoke in orders and seemed built from frost. Men like him were carried indoors by urgency. They were not kept in place by a woman at a chapel rail. He seemed to come to a decision. When he spoke, his voice shifted into that clipped register that tolerated no argument. You will not return to Voss House tonight. The sentence landed like a door closing. Christine stared at him. I must. No. My room is there. A leaking attic and a lock she controls. My papers are there. Then we recover them lawfully at daylight. My staff wages are there. The words came faster now, stripped by panic. Mrs. Finch has gone 2 weeks unpaid. Thomas has medicine on credit. If I do not return, Lady Voss will punish them for my absence. His jaw hardened. She punishes them already. She punishes them harder when she is crossed. Then she is crossed. You say that as if it cost nothing. He took 1 step closer. Close enough that she saw the old scar near his knuckles pull white when his hand flexed at his side. I say it because cost has arrived whether you acknowledge it or not. She has filed emergency guardianship. She will attempt matrimonial custody within 3 days. If you re-enter that house tonight, she can confine you as unstable, claim you are in hysterics, and produce witnesses in silk to swear it. You know this. She did know it. She had imagined it without daring to articulate it. Hearing him state the mechanism in plain language made her skin go colder under the coat. She could do that anywhere, Christine said. Not anywhere. Not under my protection. The phrase might have sounded like possession from another man. From him it sounded like strategic fact, grim and unadorned. He continued before she could shape refusal. You will stay at the Dower Lodge on Ashford Street. Mrs. Davies keeps it. Widow, 60. No gossip that survives her threshold. 2 maids, locked gate. You will have fire, food, and a desk. He had prepared this too quickly for improvisation. She narrowed her eyes. You arranged this when? When you were inside with Hale. You presumed I would obey. I prepared for the possibility that you would require shelter and refuse to ask. The precision of it unnerved her. He had looked at the same morning she had lived and drawn lines outward where she had seen only walls. Christine folded her arms inside his coat, not from modesty now, but from the need to hold herself together. "You have known me for hours." "That is sufficient." "For what?" "For judgment." Rain ran off the edge of the chapel roof in silver threads. A pair of apprentices hurried by carrying planks between them and did not slow. The world kept its indifferent pace while her life narrowed to this wet pavement and this unyielding man. "If I go with your arrangement," she said carefully, "it will be spoken of." "It is already spoken of that Lady Voss sends you through sleet in torn shoes." "That does not concern your name." "It does now." She went still. "Why?" His answer came after a beat too long to be careless. "Because I have seen enough to testify." The words settled the air between them. Testify, not rescue, not romance. A public act with legal consequence. Something that could not be withdrawn without visible cowardice. "You would stand in court over this?" she asked. "Yes." "Against Lady Voss?" "Yes." "She will call me manipulative. She will call me unstable. She will say I staged every injury." "I have eyes." "She will say you are misled by pity." His gaze sharpened. "I do not mistake pity for evidence." She believed him. That was the worst of it. Belief made room for hope, and hope had always exacted payment. He looked toward the infirmary once, then back to her. "Have you eaten?" The question startled her enough that she answered honestly. "No." "Since when?" "Last night." His face did not change, but stillness deepened in him, the kind she had seen in the yard just before he issued orders that moved men twice his size. "You will eat before any further argument." "I am not one of your soldiers." "No." The word was almost rough. "You are a claimant in a fraud action with blood on your skirt and cracked hands in winter rain. Take the nearest category you prefer." Against her will, a brief breath escaped her that was nearly another laugh. He saw it. His mouth moved by a fraction. Not quite a smile. It vanished at once. A carriage turned the corner at the end of the lane. Lanterns lit against the grey. The Ashford crest marked its door. She had not heard it approach over the rain. Halden lifted one hand. The coach slowed and stopped beside the curb with exact obedience. He did not offer his arm. He opened the carriage door himself and stepped back. Inside, she looked from the dark interior to his rain-soaked shirt and then to his face. "You are not coming." "I will ride behind. Daniel remains under observation. I will speak with Fenwick, then with my solicitor." His tone left no seam for persuasion. "You will go now." She hesitated with one foot on the step. "If I leave this street under your crest, I do not return quietly." "You were never going to return quietly," he said. The truth of it struck clean. She gathered the coat close and climbed in. The squabs smelled of wool and leather and cold air. She turned at once to hand the coat back through the open door. "I cannot keep this." "You can keep it until you are warm." "Your Grace." His eyes met hers. "Miss Kelly." He shut the door before she could shape another protest. Through rain-streaked glass she watched him step back from the wheel rut and stand motionless in the street, bareheaded now, one hand on the carriage frame until the driver flicked the reins. He did not move as the carriage rolled forward. He remained there, dark against chapel stone, watching until distance and rain took him from view. The carriage lamps swung across the wet stone and stopped before a narrow brick house set behind an iron gate, and Christine stepped down, with the Duke's coat still around her shoulders and both cuff-hidden papers damp against her skin. A widow with silver hair and a spine like a ramrod opened the door before the footman could knock. Mrs. Davies took one look at Christine's hem, her hands, her face, and moved aside without question. "Inside, Miss Kelly! Fire first! Speech later!" Warmth struck like pain. Christine stood near the grate while Mrs. Davies knelt and fed coal to the flame until it burned steady, then pressed a bowl of broth into her hands and waited until she drank every spoonful. When Holden arrived, rein still on his sleeves and Daniel's small riding glove tucked under his arm, she was seated at the writing table with the receipt from Hale and the pantry tally spread flat to dry. "Daniel?" she asked at once. "Sleeping," he said. "Fenwick expects full recovery." He set the glove beside her papers, as if placing one more fact on record. Then he laid a folded brief on the table. "Hale's copy. Filed this afternoon. Emergency guardianship hearing at 9. She intended a private order." Christine unfolded the sheet. Her own name stared up from the page in black legal hand, smaller than the damage it was built to do. She slid her annotated receipt beside it. "She has used these false household accounts as basis," Christine said. "I can show duplication and altered dates. I can show where coffee and lamp oil were entered twice." Holden's gaze moved to the pantry tally. "And the codicil?" "Not enough. Mention only." Old Thomas's interrupted sentence returned with sharp clarity. "Your father trusted paper. That was his sorrow. He had not finished because someone approached. He had left the thought hanging like a bell that never rang." Christine closed her eyes once, then looked up. "He did not trust desks in the end," she said slowly. "After the second fraud, he said ledgers hidden in offices are invitations. He began storing trial books where no creditor would search." "Where?" "In the old nursery schoolroom. Geography shelf. There was a children's atlas with a split spine. He repaired it himself instead of sending it out, and Lady Voss called it sentimental clutter." Christine stood so quickly, her chair scraped. If she never understood account cycles, she would never open it. Holden was already turning to the door. "We go now." By the first hour after midnight, they entered Voss House through the front hall under magistrate authority. 2 constables in dark coats at their heels, rainwater shining on the marble floor where Christine had once been forbidden to stand with wet shoes. Lady Voss descended the main stair in deep green silk, lavender arriving before her fury. "This is outrage," she said. "You bring officers into my house at night like common thieves." Holden did not raise his voice. "Search order, signed by Magistrate Ellery. Step aside!" Her gaze cut Christine, and contempt hardened into something more brittle. "You dragged him here for spectacle." Christine held her ground on the lower step. "I came for records." Lady Voss crossed the final distance and struck her across the face in front of footmen, kitchen maids, and both constables. The sound cracked through the hall. Christine's head turned with the blow. She tasted salt. She did not fall. Holden did not touch Lady Voss. He looked to Constable Reeve. "Witnessed that assault?" Reeve nodded, grim and precise. "Witnessed." 3 days had not yet passed. The trap had not yet closed. The clock in the entry marked 12 once, and then they moved. The nursery schoolroom sat on the 3rd floor, long unused except for trunks and moth-eaten toys. Dust lay thick on the shelves. Christine lifted each atlas in turn, fingers shaking despite herself, until she found the one with faded blue boards and a spine stitched in coarse thread too heavy for decorative repair. She set it on the table and slid a fruit knife under the seam. The thread snapped. Inside the hollowed spine rested a narrow ledger wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with her father's signet pressed in black wax. Behind her came the rustle of silk and the scrape of flint. Lady Voss stood in the doorway, holding a candle snuffed to a fierce spark at the wick. "You will not parade that filth into court," she said. Martha, the youngest kitchen maid, stood just behind her with a kindling basket, frozen and white-faced. Lady Voss reached for the ledger, failed to snatch it, and swung the lit taper toward the oilcloth instead. Christine moved on instinct, one arm shielding the book, the other pulling Martha hard against the wall and out of reach of the flame. Hot wax struck her wrist. The taper fell. Halden stamped it out at once. "Enough," he said. Constable Reeves stepped forward. "Lady Voss, you will stand back." For one suspended beat, Lady Voss's expression showed naked calculation, then closed again into injured dignity. "You all see," she said to the servants gathering in the passage. "She stages this to ruin me." Mrs. Finch answered from the threshold, voice low but clear. "We have seen enough for years." At 9 the next morning the hearing room was full before the clerk called order. Merchants came for scandal. Tenants came for fear. Servants stood at the back in plain wool and aprons, hands clasped. Christine sat at council table in the same dark dress, bruised cheek unpowdered, her father's ledger under her palm. Halden stood beside her chair and remained standing even when offered a seat. By the second hour of testimony, Lady Voss's solicitor had called Christine unstable, ungrateful, and unfit. He held up her margin notation as proof of theatrical temperament. Christine answered each question in clipped detail, page, date, and total. She submitted the pantry tally and corresponding invoice copies. She then entered the annotated receipt from Hale. She submitted the hidden ledger and identified her father's hand and seal. Magistrate Ellery requested corroboration. Old Thomas took the stand and finished the sentence he had abandoned on the stair. Her father would not leave sensitive ledgers in his office after the second deception. He hid them among nursery books and told me so himself. Mrs. Finch testified next. Coffee and lamp oil were entered twice, at Lady Voss's direction. Miss Kelly corrected quietly. She was punished for it. Constable Reeve testified to the slap and to the attempt to set flame to the recovered ledger. Then Holden Ashford gave evidence in the same measured tone he used for commands in a storm. He described the coaching yard, Christine's aid to Daniel, the bruises at her wrist, the search, the recovered ledger, the attempted burning, and the assault. Lady Voss's solicitor suggested he was compromised by attachment. Holden looked toward the bench, not toward counsel. "She speaks truth," he said. "I stake my name on it." He did not move for the next 3 hours. He refused luncheon when it was brought. He refused wine. He stood in stillness at Christine's right shoulder while clerks compared signatures and tallies, line by line, while Mr. Hale, called under order, admitted filing on Lady Voss's representations without independent audit, and while the magistrate retired to chambers with both ledgers and returned near dusk. Judgment was read with no ornament. Fraud penalties entered. Emergency guardianship petition dismissed with prejudice. Proposed matrimonial settlement voided. Control of Kelly property and accounts restored to Christine Kelly as sole inheritor under codicil and original ledger proof. Lady Voss removed from fiduciary authority and barred permanently from residence on the estate. Costs assessed. Lady Voss spoke once, voice sharp with disbelief, then stopped when the constable touched her sleeve and indicated the aisle. Silk rustled. Lavender passed. She left under public silence, which was harsher than jeering. Christine had held herself rigid through every line of the order. When the clerk finished, the room blurred at the edges. She blinked hard and felt wetness gather anyway. Holden turned to her, reading tears with grave certainty. "Christine," he said quietly, "do not grieve her." A sound rose from her throat, jagged and startled, and then she was laughing again, wet lashes and shaking shoulders, not at him, not at Lady Voss, not even at Victory, but at the simple, brutal fact that the law had spoken her name without contempt. He frowned, almost bewildered. "Why are you laughing?" She met his eyes through the tears. "Because for the first time I am not afraid." That evening, in her father's restored study, she opened the strong-box with hands that no longer shook and counted wages into Mrs. Finch's apron, then into Thomas's worn palm, then into Martha's careful fingers, and she signed each payment in the household ledger under her own name while staff stood as witnesses. Holden waited by the window until the last receipt was sealed, Daniel's recovered glove and her returned shawl folded together on the desk beside the Duke's coat. When they were alone, he spoke without preamble. "I will not offer rescue disguised as debt. If you permit it, I ask to call properly." Christine closed the ledger, laid the pen down, and faced him across the desk that had once taught her numbers and endurance both. "You may call," she said, "once each week, in daylight, with honesty. No commands unless there is fire." His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "Agreed." Outside, winter rain eased to a fine mist over the courtyard stones. Inside, the fire burned steady, and for the first time in years, the house did not feel like a sentence.